A pioneer stands in a clearing watching his neighbor struggle with the 8th day of cabin construction. The man's been at it for 2 weeks now, and he's maybe halfway done. Meanwhile, across the valley, there's a cabin that went up in 6 days. Same size, better built. The difference? One man knew a trick that most American frontiersmen had never seen. The year is 1836, and there's a problem spreading across the American frontier that nobody's talking about. Men are dying, not from Indians or bears or disease, though those kill plenty. They're dying because winter comes fast in the mountains, and building a cabin takes too damn long. In the wilderness regions of the Rocky Mountains, along the Green River, and into what would become Wyoming territory, the race against winter was brutal and unforgiving. A man who arrived in late summer had perhaps 8 weeks to fell trees, drag logs, notch corners, raise walls, install a roof, and build a chimney before the first snows made the work impossible. 8 weeks to build shelter or freeze to death. The mathematics were simple and merciless. Traditional cabin construction, the method most American pioneers learned from their fathers, required 3 to 4 weeks of hard labor for a single man working alone. With help, maybe 2 weeks for a basic structure. But help was scarce in the mountains. Trappers worked alone or in small groups. Trading post operators couldn't spare men for construction. New arrivals to the frontier had no neighbors within 50 miles. You built your cabin yourself, or you didn't survive. The standard American method, learned from English and Scots-Irish tradition, used what builders called saddle notching. You cut a rounded depression into the top of one log, then laid the next log across it. Simple, intuitive, and maddeningly slow. Each notch had to be carefully shaped with an axe, testing the fit repeatedly, adjusting until the logs sat stable. A skilled man might notch and fit 4 logs in a day. A full cabin required 60 to 80 logs minimum. The arithmetic told you everything you needed to know. But there was another method, brought to America by Scandinavian immigrants settling in Delaware and Pennsylvania as early as the 1600s. The Swedes and Finns who arrived in the New World brought ancient building techniques refined over centuries in the forests of northern Europe. They built with dovetail notching, a corner joint so ingenious, so perfectly engineered that it changed everything about log construction speed and strength. Erik Johansson wasn't the first Scandinavian in the Rockies, but he might have been the first one who understood what his ancestral building knowledge meant on the American frontier. Born in Sweden in 1804, he'd immigrated to Pennsylvania at age 12 with his father, a timber craftsman who'd built houses in the old country. By age 20, Erik was working as a carpenter in Philadelphia, but the city life didn't suit him. The mountains called. In 1828, he headed west, eventually joining the Rocky Mountain Fur Company as a trapper. Erik arrived at the Green River Trading Post in August 1836 with his season's take of beaver pelts and a plan to winter over. The post's manager, a Kentucky man named William Tompkins, was watching 3 trappers attempt to build a supply cabin before a snow. They'd been working for 9 days. The walls were maybe 4 feet high. At their current pace, they'd need another 10 days minimum, and the weather was turning. Tompkins was frustrated, the trappers were exhausted, and Erik saw an opportunity. He approached Tompkins with a proposal. Give him 1 helper and 6 days. He'd build a cabin twice as solid as what the others were struggling with. Tompkins was skeptical. This Swedish trapper wanted to use some foreign technique nobody'd heard of. But winter was coming, and Tompkins was desperate for storage space. He agreed. If Erik could deliver, he'd earn a full share of winter supplies, plus credit for the spring trapping season. If he failed, he'd work the winter for free. Erik chose his helper carefully. Thomas Wright was a young trapper from Virginia, strong as an ox and smart enough to learn quick. They started September 1st at dawn. The first thing Erik did confused Thomas completely. Instead of cutting curved saddle notches like every cabin Thomas had ever seen, Erik was making angular cuts, sharp, precise V-shaped notches that looked nothing like traditional American joinery. The dovetail notch, Erik explained as he worked, was engineered different from the start. Instead of laying logs perpendicular at corners and cutting depressions, you cut complementary angles. The bottom log got a flared notch, wider at the top than the bottom. The crossing log got a matching wedge cut, narrow at the bottom and wide at the top. When you dropped that wedge into the flare, gravity locked them together. The weight of the building itself made the joint stronger. Thomas didn't understand at first. It seemed backward. Harder? Why cut two precise angles when you could just chop a simple curved notch? Erik let him try it. He marked a log with chalk showing exactly where to cut. Thomas made the first angular notch in about 40 minutes, including several adjustments. It seemed longer than a saddle notch would take, but then Erik showed him the difference. With saddle notching, you had to carefully test each log's fit, adjusting until it sat stable. If the curve was too shallow, the log would wobble. Too deep, and you'd wasted wood and weakened the structure. Every single joint required this painstaking testing. With dovetail notching, once you established the angle, and Erik had templates marked on flat wood, you could cut notches quickly without testing. The geometry guaranteed the fit. By the end of day 1, Thomas was cutting dovetail notches in 20 minutes each. By day 2, he was down to 15 minutes. The speed came from repetition and precision. You weren't guessing and testing. You were executing the same angled cut over and over. Erik had marked his templates based on the log diameter they'd chosen, straight pines about 10 inches thick. Every notch used the same angle, the same depth, the same positioning. The second advantage revealed itself as they started raising walls. With saddle notching, the rounded joints allowed some movement. Logs could shift slightly as the wood dried and settled. This meant chinking filling gaps between logs with mud, moss, and clay was essential and time-consuming. Poorly chinked cabins let in wind, rain, and snow. Good chinking took days of careful work. Dovetail joints locked together so precisely that chinking was minimal. The angled cuts meant upper logs wedged down into lower logs with almost no gap. What spaces existed were uniform and small, easy to fill. Erik and Thomas spent maybe 3 hours total on chinking work that would have taken days with traditional methods. The third advantage was structural strength. Saddle notches held logs in place through friction and the weight of logs above. Under stress-heavy snow load, wind pressure, ground settling, the joints could shift. Not catastrophically, but enough that many pioneer cabins developed gaps and weaknesses after their first winter. Dovetail joints became stronger under load. The more weight pressed down, the tighter the wedge-shaped upper logs seated into the flared lower notches. It was self-reinforcing engineering. A dovetail cabin could handle heavier snow loads and stronger winds than a saddle-notched cabin of identical size. Day 3 brought the first test. A group of trappers from the trading post came to watch the strange Swedish building method. They saw Erik and Thomas working at a pace that seemed impossible. The walls were already 6 feet high. Traditional methods would barely have 4-foot walls by day 3. The onlookers couldn't understand how 2 men were outpacing 3 experienced builders using familiar techniques. One observer, a grizzled mountain man named Jacob Pierce, who'd built cabins from Kentucky to California, examined the corner joints closely. He ran his hand over the interlocking angles, tried to shift the logs, checked for gaps. Finally, he straightened up and said, "Well, I'll be damned. That's smart." Word spread. By day 4, there were a dozen men watching the construction. Erik, who was taciturn by nature, found himself teaching. He showed them the angle cuts, explained the geometry, demonstrated how the joints locked. Some of the watchers were skeptical, seemed like a lot of precision work for men who were used to rough frontier carpentry. Others saw immediately what Erik understood. Precision up front meant speed overall. Thomas Wright became a believer on day 5 when they installed the roof logs. Traditional cabin roofs required careful notching to create level surfaces for the roof timbers. With dovetail construction, the walls themselves were so level and tight that roof installation was straightforward. They had the entire roof structure in place by midday, something that usually took a full day or more. Day 6, September 6th, Erik and Thomas finished. Not just walls and roof, but a completed cabin. Door hung, chimney stones laid, floor packed. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid, tight, and ready for use. 6 days. The 3 builders working on the other cabin were still working on their walls, now clearly falling behind schedule. William Tompkins inspected Erik's cabin personally. He checked the corner joints, examined the roof structure, looked for gaps that would let in weather. Then he walked outside, circled the building, came back in, and said, "How in hell did you do this?" Erik's answer was simple. Different notching, Swedish method, faster and stronger. Tompkins, who'd been managing frontier trading posts for 15 years and watched hundreds of cabins go up, recognized the implications immediately. If this technique could be taught, it would change construction times across the entire frontier. Men wouldn't have to arrive in spring to have time to build before winter. New settlers could establish themselves faster. Trading posts could expand their facilities without dedicating weeks of valuable labor time to construction. He asked Erik to teach the method to anyone at the post who wanted to learn. Erik agreed on one condition. He wanted credit in the company's books as the man who brought the technique west. Not pride exactly, but recognition. In the frontier economy, reputation mattered. Tompkins agreed immediately. Over the next 2 weeks, Erik held what amounted to a cabin-building school at the Green River Post. 15 men learned dovetail notching. He made templates, showed the cuts, supervised practice joints. Most men picked it up within a day. The geometry wasn't complicated once you understood the principle. The technique spread faster than anyone anticipated. Those 15 men went to different regions: Montana, Colorado, Utah, Oregon. Each one built cabins using dovetail notching. Other builders saw the results and asked to learn. By 1840, dovetail notching was appearing in frontier cabins throughout the Rocky Mountain region. By 1845, it was standard practice for experienced builders. The impact on frontier survival was impossible to quantify precisely, but certain patterns became clear. In regions where dovetail notching became common practice, successful settlement rates increased. Men who arrived late in the season could still build adequate shelter before winter. Families could establish homesteads more quickly, freeing time for other essential work like food preparation and firewood cutting. The technique also changed cabin quality. Dovetail structures lasted longer, required less maintenance, and held heat more efficiently through tight joint construction. Frontier families living in dovetail cabins reported fewer problems with wind and moisture. The self-tightening joints meant cabins actually improved over the first winter as the wood settled and the wedges seated more firmly. There was some resistance, particularly from builders who took pride in their traditional saddle notching skills. They argued that dovetail notching required more precision and skill, which was true at first. But the counterargument was compelling. Once you learned the technique, it was actually faster and produced better results. Skill wasn't about doing things the hard way. It was about doing things the right way. The economic impact extended beyond individual survival. Trading posts and military forts that adopted dovetail construction could expand their facilities more quickly. The Hudson's Bay Company, operating throughout the Pacific Northwest, officially adopted dovetail notching for their construction projects in 1842 after company builders reported construction time reductions of approximately 40% compared to traditional methods. Military surveyors exploring Western territories in the 1840s noted in their reports the superior construction of cabins in regions where Scandinavian building techniques had been adopted. These reports influenced Army construction practices. Fort Laramie, Fort Bridger, and other frontier military installations used dovetail notching for barracks and supply buildings starting in the mid-1840s. The technique also proved adaptable. Builders discovered that the basic dovetail principle could be modified for different log sizes and building purposes. Full dovetail for main structural joints, half dovetail for interior walls, modified angles for different wood types. The geometry was flexible enough to work with whatever timber was available. Erik Johansson continued trapping until 1844, then settled permanently at Fort Hall in what would become Idaho. He built a trading house using naturally dovetail notching. The building stood until 1863, when it was deliberately dismantled to salvage the logs for another structure. Those logs, cut in 1844, were still sound and usable 19 years later, testament to the quality of dovetail construction. He trained his sons in the building method, and they worked as contractors throughout the Idaho and Montana territories in the 1850s and 1860s. The Johansson name became associated with quality cabin construction. Homesteaders would specifically seek out Swedish notching or Johansson joints when hiring builders. Thomas Wright, Erik's original helper, became one of the most successful builders in Wyoming Territory. He constructed over 200 buildings between 1836 and 1860 using dovetail notching, including homes, trading posts, and the first permanent structures in several towns. His success was built entirely on the technique Erik taught him in 6 days in September 1836. The broader story of how building techniques spread across the American frontier demonstrates how practical innovation often mattered more than dramatic invention. Nobody invented dovetail notching in 1836. It was centuries old in Scandinavia. But bringing that knowledge to the American Rockies at the right moment, when frontier expansion was creating desperate need for faster construction, made it revolutionary in its new context. The technique's spread also illustrates how frontier communities shared essential knowledge. There was no patent on dovetail notching, no attempt to monopolize the technique. Erik taught it freely because that's how frontier society worked. You shared what worked because everyone's survival depended on the community's collective capability. A man who hoarded useful knowledge wasn't respected. A man who shared it earned reputation and goodwill. By the 1850s, as frontier settlement pushed further west and professional builders became more common, construction manuals started, including dovetail notching instructions. The American Builder's Companion, published in 1854, devoted 6 pages to various notching techniques, with dovetail described as the superior method for log construction in frontier regions. The California gold rush of 1849 created massive demand for quick construction, and dovetail notching became standard practice in mining camps and boomtowns throughout the Sierra Nevada. Builders who knew the technique commanded premium wages. Men who'd learned from Erik Johansson or his students found themselves in high demand. The technique's influence extended internationally. Canadian builders adopted dovetail notching extensively throughout their western territories in the 1850s and 1860s. Australian settlers, some of whom had experience in California, brought the technique to their frontier regions. The practical advantages of faster, stronger construction transcended national boundaries. Modern log home construction still uses variations of dovetail notching. Contemporary builders recognize it as one of the strongest corner joint methods available. The geometry that made it revolutionary in 1836 remains sound today. Load-bearing tests consistently show that dovetail joints outperform simpler notching methods in strength and weather resistance. The historical irony is that dovetail notching never became universally dominant in American building. As milled lumber became available and frame construction replaced log building in settled areas, the technique became unnecessary for most construction. By the 1880s, log cabins were already becoming nostalgia rather than necessity in much of the country. But in the critical decades of frontier expansion, between roughly 1830 and 1870, the spread of Scandinavian-style dovetail notching made measurable difference in settlement success. Historians studying frontier demographics have noted that regions where the technique was adopted early showed higher rates of successful homestead establishment and lower rates of winter mortality among new settlers. The technique's story also challenges common narratives about frontier innovation. We tend to think of frontier advancement in terms of dramatic inventions, the steel plow, barbed wire, the Colt revolver. But everyday practical improvements often mattered more for ordinary people. A better way to cut corner joints saved more lives than most celebrated inventions. Erik Johansson died in 1867 at age 63, having lived long enough to see dovetail notching become common practice across the western frontier. His obituary in the Idaho Statesman newspaper, brief and matter-of-fact as frontier obituaries tended to be, noted that he taught the Swedish building method to many men, improving construction throughout the territory. That understated recognition captured frontier values perfectly. A man's worth was measured by useful contribution, not grand claims. The cabin he and Thomas Wright built in 6 days at the Green River Post in September 1836 stood until 1852, when it was dismantled to salvage materials. 16 years of continuous use, housing trappers, storing supplies, providing shelter through 16 hard mountain winters. That durability proved Erik's point better than any words could. The templates Erik carved to teach dovetail notching angles were passed down through several generations of builders in Idaho and Montana. One of those original templates, marked with Erik's initials and the date 1836, is now in the collection of the Montana Historical Society. It's a simple piece of wood with angular cuts and measurements scratched into the surface. But it represents knowledge transmission across continents and generations, practical skill enabling survival on the frontier. Thomas Wright's descendants continued building in Wyoming into the 20th century. His great-grandson, interviewed in 1932 for a WPA oral history project, recalled his grandfather saying that learning from Erik Johansson was the best 6 days' work I ever did. That education, received at age 23 in the wilderness in 1836, provided the foundation for a successful career spanning 3 decades. The technique's technical details, which seem simple now, represented genuine innovation in their frontier context. The key insight was recognizing that precision in cutting joints would save time overall by eliminating fitting and adjustment work. This ran counter to frontier instincts that valued speed over precision. Erik understood that proper preparation accelerated construction rather than slowing it. The geometry itself was elegant. A dovetail angle of approximately 70 degrees provided optimal locking strength while remaining practical to cut with an axe. Steeper angles would be too difficult to execute accurately in field conditions. Shallower angles wouldn't provide sufficient locking action. The 70-degree angle represented the sweet spot where geometry, tool limitations, and structural requirements intersected perfectly. Material efficiency was another advantage, though less obvious than speed or strength. Saddle notching removed significant wood volume from each log to create the curved depression. Those removed sections were waste. Dovetail notching removed less material because the angular cuts were smaller overall. A cabin built with dovetail joints might use 5 to 7 fewer logs than an identical cabin built with saddle notching, simply because less wood was wasted at corners. This mattered in regions where suitable timber was scarce. In the arid regions of Wyoming and Montana, finding 80 straight logs of appropriate diameter could require ranging over several square miles. Reducing the requirement to 73 logs meant less hauling distance, less labor, and faster material gathering. Every efficiency compounded. The learning curve for dovetail notching was steeper initially, but flattened quickly. A builder's first dovetail cabin might take only marginally less time than using familiar saddle notching. The second cabin would go noticeably faster. By the third cabin, the time savings became dramatic. Experienced dovetail builders reported they could complete a basic cabin in 4 to 5 days that would have taken 10 to 12 days using saddle notching. This created a knowledge economy on the frontier. Men who'd mastered dovetail notching could command better wages or trade terms for their construction labor. That economic incentive accelerated the technique's spread. Young men arriving in the mountains made a point of learning from experienced builders, and dovetail notching was considered essential knowledge for anyone serious about frontier life. The technique also proved adaptable to team building. Cabin raising parties, where communities gathered to help a new settler build shelter quickly, worked even better with dovetail notching. Once several men understood the joint geometry, they could work simultaneously on different sections of the cabin. One team cutting notches, another hauling logs, another fitting joints. The precision of dovetail cuts meant pieces prepared separately would fit together properly, enabling true parallel workflow. This parallel construction capability transformed community building practices. A group of 6 experienced men using dovetail methods could raise a complete cabin, start to finish, in 2 days. These intensive building sessions became social events, combining practical assistance with community bonding. The speed and efficiency of dovetail construction made such gatherings more feasible because participants weren't committing to a week or more of labor. The military implications, while secondary to civilian impact, were significant. Army units establishing temporary posts in frontier territories could construct necessary facilities much faster using dovetail notching. This improved the Army's ability to project power and maintain presence in remote areas. Cavalry patrols could build secure winter quarters in days rather than weeks, extending their operational season. The technique's influence on architectural standards was subtle, but real. As frontier towns grew from temporary camps to permanent communities, early dovetail cabins often became the core structures around which larger buildings developed. That initial construction quality meant these buildings could be expanded or modified rather than replaced. Towns that might have needed to rebuild their entire infrastructure as they grew could instead build around solid existing structures. The story of dovetail notching spread across the American frontier represents a type of innovation often overlooked in historical narratives, focused on dramatic inventions and prominent figures. This was innovation through knowledge transfer, taking proven techniques from one context and applying them where they were unknown but desperately needed. Erik Johansson's contribution wasn't invention, but recognition and transmission. He recognized that his ancestral building knowledge had value in his adopted homeland. He transmitted that knowledge effectively, teaching it in ways that allowed it to spread organically through frontier communities. And he did it without seeking glory or compensation beyond practical recognition. That pattern of practical innovation characterized much of frontier development. The American West was settled not primarily through dramatic breakthroughs, but through thousands of small improvements in technique, each making survival slightly more likely and prosperity slightly more achievable. Better notching, better plowing, better water management, better food preservation, better tool use. These incremental improvements compounded into transformation. The frontier of 1870 was vastly more survivable than the frontier of 1830, not because of any single major change, but because of accumulated practical knowledge. Settlers in 1870 inherited 4 decades of learned experience about what worked and what didn't, what techniques were effective and what were wasteful. Dovetail notching was one thread in that larger tapestry of practical innovation. Not the most important thread, perhaps, but a significant one. The thousands of frontier families who spent their winters in tight, warm cabins built with Swedish-style corner joints had reason to thank Erik Johansson and the men who learned from him, whether they knew it or not. The final measure of the technique's impact comes from its persistence. Long after log cabins ceased being necessity and became nostalgia, builders who valued quality continued using dovetail notching. Modern craftsmen building traditional log homes study historical techniques, and dovetail joints remain the gold standard for corner construction. The geometry that worked in 1836 still works today, unchanged and unchallenged. That timeless quality distinguishes genuinely good technique from temporary expedient. A method that survives not through tradition or habit, but through persistent practical superiority, has proven itself across generations and changing contexts. Dovetail notching has met that test. The 6 days in September 1836, when Erik Johansson and Thomas Wright built a cabin at the Green River Trading Post, might seem unremarkable in the grand sweep of frontier history. No famous names, no dramatic events, no lasting monument. Just 2 men building a shelter that would be torn down 16 years later, using a technique that one man learned as a child and taught to another. But that modest beginning set in motion a transformation in frontier construction that affected thousands of people and influenced settlement patterns across the American West. All because one Swedish immigrant recognized that his father's old country building knowledge could solve a New World problem, and because he was willing to share what he knew. That's the real impossible trick, not the technique itself, which was centuries old, but the willingness to teach it, the recognition of its value in a new context, and the understanding that practical innovation matters more than tradition when survival is at stake. The American frontier rewarded practical knowledge above almost everything else. A man could be uneducated, rough, uncultured, but if he knew how to do useful things well, he was valued. Erik Johansson knew how to build cabins better than most men on the frontier. He shared that knowledge freely, and in doing so, he changed how Americans built their homes in the wilderness. That's worth remembering, not because it's dramatic or exciting, but because it's true, and because it represents a type of innovation that built America as surely as any famous invention, the quiet passing of practical knowledge from one person to another, making life incrementally better for those who came after. The cabin-building revolution that cut construction time in half didn't come from genius invention or dramatic breakthrough. It came from an immigrant remembering how his father built houses in Sweden, recognizing that method would work better in Montana, and teaching that technique to anyone willing to learn. Simple as that, and as profound as that, the best innovations often are.